From hard labor challenges to deportation and everything in between, the Victorian era had some truly terrible punishments for women. First on our list are the asylums. These were places that absolutely nobody wanted to visit. Now, while some people were sent here for real issues, other women who tried to advocate for basic rights back in the day could also be institutionalized to try and clear their heads. While the institutions were initially designed to try and cure psychological issues, the practices that went on here were absolutely dreadful. Research into mental health issues in the Victorian era was slim to none, so many people honestly believed that anyone suffering was possessed by an evil spirit. This prompted the use of horrible procedures such as lobotomies that caused more pain than they cured, and other terrifying medical practices that served absolutely no purpose. While drilling holes into a person's head was more of a medieval practice, some asylums reportedly still tried to perform this in the Victorian era. Others would use exorcism if they felt their patients were possessed by the devil, so it's pretty clear to see that nobody actually knew what they were doing in these facilities. Up next is hanging. This was a pretty straightforward punishment that was very gruesome from start to finish. Anyone who was found guilty of committing a serious crime could face capital punishment. One of the easiest ways to do this in the Victorian era was hanging the criminal. There was absolutely no way out of this once the punishment had been declared, and the guilty party knew their time was up. But if the hanging itself wasn't bad enough already, these punishments often drew large crowds who wanted to watch it for themselves. That's right, the punishers would actually advertise your hanging to the general public. It seems like this was considered a form of entertainment back in the day. So for the criminal's final moments, a priest would read them their final rites before the punishment was performed, and everyone applauded that you were gone for good. That is a pretty terrible way to go for so many reasons. After that, we have hard labor. If the authorities felt they could still extract some work from their criminals, they might be able to keep them out of prison. This obviously came with a huge catch, however, so these people might have been begging to head to prison after receiving their own fates. Some of the criminals from the Victorian era were sentenced to hard labor that many people couldn't even withstand. This would involve construction and other tasks that involved heavy lifting or dangerous activities, and prisoners would rarely ever receive any breaks. This usually meant that prisoners were working in extremely harsh conditions that were incredibly inhumane, but authorities really didn't care about their well-being. It didn't even take a serious crime to be summoned to the hard labor jobs, which many people already considered to be capital punishment. Due to the physical demands and the lack of breaks, many people just never made it back. Next up are the lack of rights. This was a never-ending punishment that women had to live with every day in the Victorian era. Times were extremely difficult back in the 1800s, as the majority of women were not able to partake in basic activities that played massive impacts on society and day-to-day life. They were not allowed to vote on elected officials, many of them were not allowed to work a full-time job, and the list goes on and on. The only times they were able to pick up steady work was when it was handed to them as punishment for committing a crime. And more often than not, that crime could have been something as simple as protesting for women's rights. The ruling authorities had no interest in hearing their demands, and it was clear they considered women as second-class citizens. It was incredibly hard for any of them to garner support from their male counterparts, as the system was clearly designed to keep them behind. Now, thankfully, times have changed for the better, but the Victorian era was never easy for women. Our next punishment is the crank. This might not be considered a terrifying punishment in the traditional sense, but is definitely pretty grueling. Many prisons had incredibly pointless tasks for their inmates, and some of these were designed just to wear them down. The infamous crank was one of these ridiculous punishments that really took a toll on many prisoners in the Victorian era. This was basically just a large metal crank that turned nothing on the other side and simply existed to be a nuisance. It was very heavy and hard to turn, and its only purpose in the world was to serve as a demoralizing punishment. Prisoners would often be randomly selected to turn the crank 10,000 times in one sitting. They would rarely ever get a chance to catch their breath. It was usually right in plain sight as well, which meant that other prisoners could watch their fellow inmates suffer in agony as they turned the crank. This annoying task would pretty much turn a person's arms into jello if they didn't pass out from dehydration. After that, we have police beatdowns. The Victorian era introduced many new ideas and inventions, and one of them was the conventional police force. Sir Robert Peel introduced London's very first police force in 1829 as a way to try and reduce crime. Many citizens initially had a tough time trusting this new group of law enforcement, but they started to earn themselves a better image as they began taking down more criminals. While their popularity was slowly growing, some groups of people really didn't care for them at all. These early police officers were paid terribly low wages, so many of them really didn't care about certain policies. This meant that police brutality was a reoccurring issue back in the day, as many people report being attacked by officers over very small offenses. It didn't really seem to matter if it was a man or a woman who was being targeted. Some of the officers just stepped way over the line, and this caused many people to fear them. Up next, we have deportation. deportation. The United Kingdom had a lot of power over its colonies hundreds of years ago, and they used them for a multitude of different reasons. Australia had the unfortunate title of being a bit of a dumping ground for some of Britain's most unwanted criminals. If the ruling authorities in the UK decided that their prisons were overrun, or they simply didn't want to handle a certain criminal themselves, they would often send them off to Australia. It didn't even matter if the prisoner was a citizen of the United Kingdom, they could easily be deported to the land down under, or they would be stuffed into some very hard-nosed prisons. Now, the conditions in these jails were pretty tough, and inmates were often mistreated and put through harsh physical labor. There was absolutely no guarantee if they would ever be sent back to Britain once they had served their full sentence, and their time spent in Australia was never a fun ride. Next on our list is the treadmill. Now, much like the terribly annoying crank, the treadmill was another pointless task that prisoners would often be handed inside a jailhouse. Now, you could technically argue this was giving the prisoners access to free cardio workouts, but that is not at all what it was designed for. This was an activity that was separate from inmates' regular time in the gym, and it only existed to wear them down and punish them over and over again. A person has the ability to stop their own cardio workout when they get tired, but these prisoners had to stay on the treadmill until the guards decided that their task had been fulfilled. The treadmills were not as smooth as they are today, so people could easily fall off and get hurt from the unsteady steps. On top of that, the punishment would usually last until the person was too tired to even stand. At that point, it stops being a cardio exercise and just turns into a grueling form of punishment. After that, we have penny dreadfuls. Being forced to read a book doesn't sound like the worst thing in the world for most people. That's because not all books are like these ones. Penny dreadfuls were very cheap books that explained crimes in terrifying fashion. These books were often incredibly graphic. It was designed to scare people away from committing any crimes. But they were sometimes handed out to the general public to keep them in line. They were also handed out in prisons to scare the life out of the inmates. Some of the authorities saw this as a form of rehabilitation for troubled inmates to make them think about exactly what they did. Now, perhaps this might have worked on some occasions, but these books could have also had a reverse effect. The terrifying tales would sometimes send a person right over the edge and send them into a terrifying state of mind. The books could also be seen as glorifying certain crimes and could even incentivize a criminal to commit even more sinful acts. And finally, we have the silent system. So it turns out many prisons didn't even enjoy hearing their inmates speak. It didn't matter if it was a jail in Britain or in Australia, these Victorian-era prisons had a terrible practice that was known as the silent system. While prisoners could speak freely in their own cells, they were not allowed to communicate with their fellow inmates in common areas like the gym. They would often be forced to wear a cap that covered their face to let everyone know they were not allowed to talk, and communication was off limits. Now, maybe this would have stopped any shady dealings from happening inside the prison, but it also caused even more hatred between the inmates and the guards. This would sometimes lead to some terrible riots from the prisoners. The silent system was not enjoyable punishment for anybody, and if anyone was daring enough to break the no-talking rules, they could be handed some pretty severe consequences. Number 10, throwing garbage at the bride and groom in Scotland. Scotland's a pretty old country, so they obviously have some old school traditions that have stood the test of time. But one of the weirdest of the bunch revolves around their weddings and how they treat the bride and groom. Just before the holy ceremony is supposed to take place, friends and family of the engaged couple gather together for an old tradition that is known as blackening. Basically, what happens here is the friends and family throw all sorts of substances at the bride and groom, including mud and rotten food, to make a real mess before the actual wedding begins. It is believed that this old tradition is supposed to prepare the couple for the tough challenges they will face in their new life together and act as a rite of passage into marriage. While it may seem hard to believe that there is a pre-wedding tradition that could steal the actual ceremony's thunder, this one definitely holds a weird and special place in the hearts of the Scottish people. Number 9, no bathrooms for 3 nights in Indonesia. One of the absolute worst feelings in the world is needing to use a bathroom and not being able to find one. The only thing that could be even worse than this is knowing exactly where the bathroom is and not being allowed to use it. While this may sound like some sort of medieval torture method, it is actually an age-old ritual in many southern Asian countries such as Indonesia. The marriage tradition states that the bride and groom must be confined to their home for 3 nights, and they are not allowed to use the washroom during this time. The tradition also calls for their family and friends to smear the couple in rice, flour, and ash, and they use this as a way to symbolize their transition into a new life together. The families and friends will also keep a close eye on the bride and groom to ensure that they do not cheat and use the washroom or wash the food mixture off of their bodies. The Indonesians believe that the couple enduring this challenging period together will serve as a trial by fire and better prepare them for the road ahead. Number 8. Mass kissing in Sweden. Okay, so to some people, this may not sound like such a bad idea when you first hear it, but when you consider that it involves a bunch of men kissing the bride-to-be, it does sound a little bit unholy in the eyes of a traditional wedding ceremony. However, these Swedish people have decided that if the groom ever leaves the room during the ceremony, then the male guests who are attending the wedding are free to kiss the bride as many times as they like until the groom returns. This definitely seems a bit out of the ordinary, but it's regarded as a lighthearted joke to keep the wedding fun and laid back. And if you thought the bride was the only one who could be a target of the kissing mania, then you would be wrong. As it turns out, the bride also has an action that can set off a total frenzy at the wedding. If she gets up from her seat at any point during the ceremony, then the female guests are allowed to kiss the groom until the bride returns to her seat. There probably aren't too many countries around the world where this would be accepted, but Sweden has fully embraced the kissing tradition. Number 7. Beating the groom's feet in South Korea. This one is probably just as painful as it sounds. After the wedding ceremony has completed and the newlyweds have started their new life together, the groom's first taste of married life is getting his feet absolutely destroyed by a whole host of painful objects. In South Korean culture, the groom's family and friends will tie his ankles together after the wedding and hold him down on a table while they search for whatever items they can find to beat his feet with. The items can range from sticks and rods and even dried fish, and the groom must endure the painful ritual until the family and friends decide that they are satisfied. On top of that, the ones doing the beating will usually ask the groom some strange riddles and trivial questions to add a bit of a humorous twist to the bizarre ritual. The beating is supposed to be a way to test the groom's strength and character, and although it may have a lighthearted feel to it, there's no way the groom wouldn't be feeling the pain for a long time after it was all over. Number 6. Carrying fire in South Africa. There are many interesting wedding traditions that take place in South Africa, but one of the oldest and wildest of the bunch is the fire carrying. This old South African tradition calls for the parents of the bride and the groom to bring fire to the home of the newlyweds. It must be pretty hard to transport a burning fire from house to house, but this tradition holds a special place in the heart of many South Africans and provides a blessing to the bride and the groom. The fire is meant to symbolize the coming together of the newlyweds and ignite the hearth in their new home. This is why it is important for the fire to be transported directly from their childhood homes by their own parents, because it will ensure that the family legacy is carried on for eternity. So while some people might think this is a little bit crazy and a bit of a fire hazard, it is an important South African tradition that will most likely last forever. Number 5. Saws for the newlyweds in Germany. People can receive a ton of weird wedding gifts, but in Germany, it is a guarantee that the bride and the groom will receive a beautiful new saw. Yeah, a power tool might not seem like the most beautiful thing to receive on your wedding day, but this tool actually has a very important meaning when it comes to German weddings. It is actually tradition for the bride and groom to saw a massive log together following their wedding ceremony. And since it is a two-person saw and the couple needs to act together to cut the log in half, the challenge is meant to symbolize the strength of the new couple working together and prepare them for the challenges they will face in life. It's also key that the couple is still wearing their wedding attire during the log cutting, which means that those fancy tuxedos and dresses will be covered in wood chips after the ceremony is complete. Now, thankfully, the log cutting is pretty popular in Germany, so you shouldn't have any problems explaining the wood chips once it's time to return the rental attire. Number 4. Stealing the groom's shoes in India. So in Korea, the groom has his shoes removed for a ceremonial foot beating, but in India, the groom's shoes are likely to be stolen altogether. While some people might think a burglar had broken into the wedding with a desire to steal the shoes, it turns out the real culprits are actually the bride's female friends. It's not really known how this bizarre prank started in the first place, but this is a fairly common and humorous tradition that occurs at Indian weddings. If the groom does not keep a watchful eye on his shoes before the ceremony takes place, there's a good chance they will go missing. The friends will hide the shoes from the groom, who has two options for getting them back. He can either go hunting for them himself and hope he finds them before the ceremony begins, or he can bribe the girls to tell him where they hid the shoes. Considering how embarrassing it would be to show up to your own wedding with no shoes on, your safest bet would probably be to just pay the girls immediately and find out where they hid the shoes. Number 3. The gift of teeth in Fiji. If that one sounds weird to you, that's because it is. Thankfully, it's not human teeth that are being gifted at weddings in Fiji, but it is actually a sperm whale tooth. Before a groom can even think about advancing to the wedding ceremony in this country, he must first ask permission from the father of the bride-to-be. However, just asking for the father's blessing is not enough, and a grand gesture must also be made for the groom to earn the respect of his potential father-in-law. A traditional proposal on the island of Fiji involves the groom and his family presenting the bride's father with a giant tooth from a sperm whale, as this is considered a sacred item in the nation. While this tradition is generally more popular in rural areas, it is still very prevalent all over the country. However, obtaining a sperm whale tooth does not sound like such an easy task. The groom will more than likely have to find someone who is selling a tooth, and they can sometimes cost hundreds of dollars. Add that onto the already expensive wedding ring, and proposals on the island nation really start to add up. Number 2, brides dancing for money in Cuba. The title of this one definitely sounds a little unholy and probably wouldn't be very well received in many countries around the world, but this is an old tradition at Cuban weddings. It is actually common for other men to dance with the bride at her own wedding in Cuba. However, it's not as simple as just walking up to her and busting a move. In Cuba, any man aside from the groom who wishes to share a dance with the bride will have to come up with some cash if he wants to join in on the fun. The strangest part about this tradition though is that the money is not just handed over in a traditional manner. The men who end up dancing with the bride will actually pin the cash to the bride's dress, and by the end of the dancing festivities, she will be covered in money. While it's pretty obvious to see why this might not look so good in other countries, the cash that the bride earns from the dancing directly supports the newlyweds' honeymoon plans. So it is actually in the best interest of the groom to encourage his friends to dance with his new wife on their special day. And at number 1, spitting on the bride in Kenya. Alright, now the money thing doesn't sound like such a weird idea. This is pretty much exactly what it sounds like, but the meaning behind it is actually very good. And instead of the bride having money pinned to her, Kenyans believe it is a blessing to have the father of the bride spit on her. This is a very old tradition in Kenya that dates all the way back to the early Maasai people, who believed that spitting on someone was a sign of respect. So in this case, the father of the bride spits on his own daughter to show his respect and congratulations for the start of her new married life. It's definitely interesting to see how different acts are treated around the world, because a foreigner who was attending a Kenyan wedding would probably think there was a terrible incident unfolding if they saw someone spit on the bride. There are many other wedding traditions from the Maasai tribe, including the groom trading animals in exchange for the bride, but the spitting seems to be the most popular in modern times.
Coverture, also known as martial unity or femme covert, was a legal doctrine that existed in many Western societies until the 19th century, but also, in some way they're still kind of there. The concept of coverture significantly impacted the legal status and rights of women upon marriage. Once the central aspects of coverture was the merging of a woman's legal identity is that of hers and her husband's were as of one upon marriage. This meant that in the eyes of the law, a married woman and her husband became a single legal entity. Any property that she owned, including real estate and personal belongings, would become her husband's upon marriage. She could not enter into contracts or control her own finances independently, and in cases of divorce or separation, the legal custody of children were almost always granted to the husband, as the legal doctrine considered him to be the head of the household. The impact of coverture varied across different jurisdictions and evolved over time. While coverture was deeply ingrained in legal systems for centuries, it faced increasing criticism during the 19th century and eventually underwent reforms. The movement of women's rights, including the first wave of feminism, played a significant role in challenging and dismantling coverture laws. Number 9. Corset Regulations. During the late 19th and early 20th century, there were instances of corset regulations in some regions. Particularly in the United States, these regulations were attempts to address concerns about women's health and their public morality and the potential impact of corsets on the female body. Some US states and cities enacted laws that specifically specified the maximum length of corsets. These regulations were aimed at preventing the creation of extremely long corsets, which were considered not only a fashion concern, but also a potential health risk. Enforcing corset regulations proved challenging as it required monitoring and measuring women's undergarments, which were both impractical and invasive. Compliance was difficult to ensure, and these regulations were not universally followed or reinforced, as over time, societal attitudes towards women's fashions and health evolved, and the popularity of corsets waned. Ultimately, the decline of corsets in women's fashions was driven by challenging aesthetics, fashion preferences, and evolving views on women's health. Number 8. Anti-flirtation laws. Anti-flirtation laws were laws or ordinances that at various points in history sought to regulate or prohibit what was considered inappropriate or aggressive flirting behavior in public spaces. These laws were often subjective and reflecting societal norms and values about modesty, decency, and public conduct. The term anti-flirtation laws is commonly associated with the early 20th century in the United States. During this period, some cities enacted laws or regulations aimed at curbing what authorities deemed as inappropriate or unwanted flirtatious behavior. In some cases, though, anti-flirtation laws were actually presented as a measure to protect women from unwelcome advances or harassment. The laws were framed as a way to ensure that a woman could move through public spaces without facing unwanted attention. Enforcing anti-flirtation laws posed challenges, as the laws were vague and determining what constituted inappropriate flirting was inherently subjective. The laws were sometimes criticized for being overly intrusive and arbitrary. Anti-flirtation laws faced criticism from various quarters. Civil liberties advocates argued that such laws encroached upon individuals' rights to free expression and personal interactions. As societal attitudes became more permissive, the enforcement of these laws ended up becoming increasingly unattainable. Number 7. Unequal inheritance laws. Historically, many societies had laws governing inheritance that were unequal and discriminatory, favoring male heirs over female heirs. These laws, rooted in patriarchal norms, often restricted women's rights to inherit property, land, or other assets. Practice like primogeniture is a system of inheritance in which the firstborn son inherits the entire estate of the parents, as this practice excludes daughters and younger sons from inheriting significant portions of the family's wealth. The Borough English system was also a variant of primogeniture in which the youngest son inherited the family estate, while the elder sons received other forms of compensation. Like primogeniture, it disadvantaged daughters in terms of inheritance. While dower rights provided some protections for widows by granting them a portion of their husband's estate, they were often limited compared to the inheritance rights of sons. Dower rights varied, and in some cases widows received only a life interest in a portion of the estate. Over time, reform movements and challenges and changes in societal attitudes led to legal reforms aimed at addressing gender-based inequalities in inheritance. These reforms sought to ensure the daughters had equal rights to inherit all the family property, or whatever is in the will. Number 6. Restrictions on working hours. Restriction on hours for women were common in various parts of the world, often based in societal norms, gender roles, and concerns about women's well-being. These restrictions were part of the labor laws or social norms that limited the hours when women could work, the type of jobs that they could engage in, and in some cases the conditions under which they could work. Laws and regulations in many places historically imposed restrictions on the number of hours women could work in a day or a week. These restrictions were often based on the assumption that women needed protection and rest during their roles as caregivers in the family. Certain professions and industries had explicitly exclusions for women, limiting their participation based on perceived physical or emotional limitations. For example, some jurisdictions restricted women from working in certain heavy industries or underground mining. Over time, however, changes in social attitudes and evolving perceptions of gender roles contributed to the relaxation of restrictions on working hours for women. As the women's rights movement gained momentum, there was an increase in recognition of women's rights to work without undue restrictions. Number 5. Footbinding in China. Footbinding was a traditional practice in China that involved tightly binding the feet of young girls to prevent normal growth and create small, delicate feet. This practice, which lasted for centuries, had profound cultural, social, and physical implications. The origins of footbinding are not entirely clear, but it is believed to have emerged during the Song dynasty and became widespread during the Ming and Qing dynasty. Footbinding was considered a symbol of beauty and social status. Small bound feet were associated with this feminine grace and delicacy, as it was seen as a mark of a woman's commitment to cultural norms and societal expectations. The bound foot had erotic connotations in Chinese culture, and the practice was linked to a concept of lotus feet. The process of foot binding was often fetishized, and the sight of a woman unbinding her feet was considered intimate. Ew. Social reformers, missionaries, and women's rights activists played a key role in campaigning against foot binding. The practice was finally officially banned in 1912 after the fall of the Qing dynasty, although it does still continue in some areas for a period. Number 4. Banning women on voting. Bans on women voting, also known as the women's suffrage restrictions, were historical practices that denied women the right to participate in political elections and vote. Such restrictions were widespread and persisted in various countries, such as much of history in the 19th and early 20th century saw the emergence of women's suffrage movements advocating for equal voting rights. Activists argue that women, like men, should have the right to participate in democratic processes. The Seneca Falls Convention in the United States in 1848 is often considered the starting point of the women's suffrage movement. At the convention, attendees, including prominent figures like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, discussed the need for women's rights, including the right to vote. The aftermath of World War I saw changes in the suffrage laws in various countries. In 1918, the United Kingdom passed the Representations of People's Act granting voting rights to certain women, and the US ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, enfranchising American women. Over time, women's suffrage became a global movement, and many countries progressively extended voting rights to women. The mid-20th century saw a shift towards universal suffrage, where voting rights were not restricted based on gender. Number 3. Limitation on jury services. Limitation on jury services historically for women were common in many jurisdictions, reflecting prevailing gender norms and societal expectations about women's roles. Such limitations often took the form of legal restrictions or cultural bases that excluded or restricted women's participation in jury duty. In some common law traditions, which include legal systems in countries like the United Kingdom and the United States, women were historically excluded or had limited participations in jury services. This exclusion was based on traditional views of women's roles as caregivers, and they perceived the lack of qualifications for legal decision-making or critical thinking. Women's rights advocates and suffragists challenged these exclusions, arguing that women were fully capable of serving as impartial jurors. In the 20th century, legal reforms aimed at dismantling gender-based barriers began to take effect. Legal challenges based on the principle of equal protection under the laws played a role in striking down gender-based exclusions. Courts began to recognize that excluding women from jury service solely based on their gender violated principles of equality and fairness. Despite legal reforms, challenges relating to gender-based biases in jury selections and other systematic issues persist. Efforts continue to address barriers to equal representation on jurors and to ensure diversity and fairness in the judicial system. Number 2. Modesty laws. Modesty laws, referred to as the regulations or dress codes that prescribe a certain standard of modesty in public attire. These laws are often influenced by cultural, religious, or societal norms that seek to regulate clothing choices in alliance with a perceived standard of decency. If you ever heard or seen in regards to dress codes, they are also in an alliance in some sort of modesty forums made in certain spaces. Various societies have implemented dress codes or modesty laws that dictate acceptable clothing in public spaces. These codes may specify the length of skirts and the coverage of shoulders or wearing the head's coverings. In some parts of Southeast Asia, if your hair is too long, your teachers actually somehow have the right to cut your hair short. In the US, if you do show your shoulders as a young girl, you could be asking for it. It's truly insane the limitations of these so-called dress codes of control of how one's dressed, no matter the context, is still apparent. Even in women's choices to wear the hijab, and laws in France as well in Quebec have limited or fully banned religious wear like the niqab or burqa when it comes to a woman who actually wants to wear it. Regardless what a person chooses to wear, just mind your damn business. And finally, number 1. Restrictions on education. Throughout history, women have faced various restrictions on education with limited access to formal learning opportunities. These restrictions were often rooted in societal norms, traditional gender roles, and discriminatory beliefs about women's intellectual capabilities. These restrictions were often rooted in societal norms, traditional gender roles, and discriminatory beliefs about women's intellectual capabilities. Women were frequently excluded from institutions of higher learning. Universities and colleges were historically male-dominated, and women faced significant barriers to enrollment. When they were admitted, their choices of study were often limited to certain suitable fields. For example, Ruth Bader Ginsburg had mentioned during her studies at Harvard it was a very rare few amount of women were allowed into these highly academic spaces, only to be challenged why were they there when a man should have been there instead. Restrictions on women's educations were not limited to any specific region or culture. Different societies impose on varying degrees of restrictions, and progress towards gender-inclusive education has occurred at different rates around the world. While progress has been made, challenges to women's education persist in some regions. Factors such as poverty, cultural norms, and gender-based violence can be impeded access to education for girls and women. As an example, Malala Yousafzai is one of who's personally experienced violence for advocating for education for women. But thankfully, with her survival and recovery, her activism still persists in encouraging and inspiring women everywhere to strive for education. Number 10. Marriage.
More good women have lost a marriage into war, famine, disease, and disaster.
I know some might think initially that this isn't a punishment, but in the cases of the Victorian women, the societal status of being a woman was only seen based off of the ideologies that needed to be pure and clean. Your bodies were seen as temples, and it shouldn't be decorated with jewelry, nor should it be used for physical activities or your own personal pleasures. You couldn't oppose men, and you being wealthy or a spinster was the only exception. Single women were looked down on with shame and pitied, and as your main purpose as a woman was to marry and reproduce. Even young girls at the age of 8 to 12 would stop working as if there was no child labor laws or protection laws for children, and as soon as these women or young girls were able to menstruate, they would be negotiated into marriage and no longer be able to sustain themselves financially or just be a kid. And being a poor married woman wasn't an option, as you had no individual rights under law. Married women were only seen as one with their husband, and the husband would be the manager and entitled to all of your properties, as it was seen more as a business, and you were being micromanaged constantly until death do you part. Number 9. No rights. As I mentioned with marriage, women didn't have any rights, as they were seen primarily as second-class citizens, and if you were a woman of color, my goodness, you were definitely seen less than human. Women who had to be married ended up losing everything they owned, inherited or earned, and it would belong to their husband. Once a woman married, control of any property she owned as well as any income she received from it passed to her husband. Although he could not dispose of it without her consent, her property, her personal property such as money, or earnings or investments, and personal belongings such as jewelry passed absolutely into his control. She could not part with them without his consent, and if you were in a loveless marriage or a harmful one, you couldn't divorce your husband. Divorce wasn't even a concept for women to execute without losing their own amenities, even in the court of law until the 1970s, almost 100 years or so later, after the spark of the women's suffrage movement in the mid-late 1800s. So men had the right to divorce his wife under the grounds of adultery, but women had to prove her husband was unfaithful, combined with other allegations including cruelty, bigamy, incest, and so on. Luckily, in the 1857 Act, divorce did become a bit easier little by little, but again only under the impression that the woman had legal grounds and proof her husband was unfaithful, with evidentiary support to back up her claims. And even then, she could finally earn some of her possessions. As for the husbands, if he wanted to divorce his wife, he didn't have to do anything, he could just say it and it would be fine. Number 8. No education. To me, education is extremely important, as it was something I learned growing up in my family, that education liberates you to understand yourself, those around you, and the world better. And for women in this era, they were received less education than men. They were banned from universities and could only obtain low-income paying jobs, as she was not allowed to follow a profession, as they were all closed to women. And the irony of them having Queen Victoria as the reigning accolade of this era, a woman and women of these times couldn't get an education to liberate herself or her children from defamation if the husband no longer sees her as a useful asset. So for women, especially those who could afford it, was raised in a privileged household with financial backings and exceptional family background, her education was only seen as accomplishments. Like, oh darling, she's a very accomplished woman, is something you might hear in these type of movies that depict the era, which only indicates that she had artistic talents like singing, dancing, and knowing foreign languages, and anything to help earn them a husband and be a benefit in the house. Even doctors at this time believed that if a woman studied too much education, she would stunt her ability to reproduce. Wild as hell. And when university allowed women to attend their lecture halls, their families would actually forbid them from going, worried that it would prevent them from finding a husband. Number 7. The right to work. Work was only available to those who had no choice, as their societal status prevented them from leveling up to the ladder to have a better life independently. Even more so, women who were labeled as part of the working class, these women fueled the industrial revolutions, making up to 60 to 80% of the working force in light industries such as cotton manufacturing. Even more so, those who were labeled as part of the working class, women of this era fueled the industrial revolutions, making up to 60 to 80% of the workforce in light industries such as cotton manufacturing. Women that had jobs outside of the home made them less likely to marry, leaving them with no choice but to stay in undesirable situations that made them undesirable themselves. In one study by the Buffalo State had noticed classing women and children together as helpless creatures needing the protection of strong men. They were indignant at the knowledge that women had to support themselves, that they had suffered degrading wrongs as working women. So for some, they'd have to result themselves into committing adult work, or even for some unfortunate circumstances, be sold into adult work, as they had often had heavy debts from predecessors or even used as bargaining chips for their partners. Poor women were not regarded as the Victorian society, as they could not fight back, as men had captured these women, straight up kidnapping them and kept them at their house. Differences in societal classes led to some women being ignored and unacknowledged in society for economic reasons and for the pleasures of some men. Women of the night had no exits of this profession and were stuck in this life, and they would be beaten, tormented, as this was obviously shamed on, as well as being arrested, which would lead us to number 6. Number 6. Women who were in prison. In some revolutionary standpoints, being in prison might make you look like a hero or a villain, as it depends on what you were doing or what you stood for. For the Victorian era, women who had been the most vocal at this time for a multitude of things like women's rights, the women who were caught in the act of selling their bodies in order to obtain financial means would be arrested and sent to prison. But even women who were not adult workers would be arrested. Women who had premarital pregnancies, truancies, or adultery, or kept bad company would also be arrested. They would be sent to prisons or reformities, as for women of these times, a small step off of the Victorian pedestal made for a long fall. Women sent to prison in the Victorian England were subjected to regimes whose projects was was to enforce idealized femininity. This individualized treatment aimed at more regeneration than discipline and was administered by an entirely female staff aided by middle-class philanthropic lady visitors. Considering women were placed only into two categories, being a wife and a mother, the reality is that they lived in a world that discriminated heavily against them. Due to their superior physical strength, men considered themselves the dominant sex and sought to keep women subdued for as long as they could. Number 5. Prison life. Being accused of being an idle and disorderly woman seems like a very vague and inconvenient statement today, as it holds no worthy of prosecution, but for these women of these times, you would definitely go to jail for that. These roughly defined offenses were common charges against women in the 18th century. At least in some records of the names of these women have survived, there are two on the list who are sadly identified only known as an unknown woman, cannot give any account of herself, and the other being accused of being a vagrant and an idiot. Which, of course, being an idiot isn't a crime unless you're doing something idiotic that hurts another person. Then yeah, I guess being an idiot is a crime. It is possible that up to 2/3 of prisoners in the House of Corrections, like the one at the prison called the Wakefield House of Correction, were female. Beating hemp was the usual form of hard labor, as well as if the women refused to comply or being able to commit to tasks, whipping and beatings were also a commonplace, particularly to those who convicted of vagrancy, lewd conduct, and night walking. Number 4. Domestic harm. This is sort of stemming back to the whole marriage thing in number 10, as it basically ties in on how horrible life was being a woman in the Victorian era, or just being a woman in general in any historical time. With these sacrifices and determinations of these women, as they ensured the women like me were able to gain access slowly but surely to equal rights, but sadly when it comes to marriage for some of these women, they're also at risk of being in harmful relationships that were extremely normalized at the time. Violence against women and the lack of protection was common, as there were no laws for the physical violations they had to endure. After all, when you got married, everything you owned belonged to your husband, and so did your body, with or without consent. Domestic violence was an issue that captivated the Victorian imagination due to the unprecedented visibility that domestic harm began to receive in the press and the emergence of an ongoing debate during the 1840s and the 1850s. Domestic violence was an issue that captivated the Victorian imagination due to the unprecedented visibility that domestic harm began to receive in the press and the emergence of an ongoing debate during the 1840s and 1850s about the domestic harm and other marriage issues that affected women. Like all laws that slowly opened gateways to other clauses, the 1828 Offences Act that targets working class violence helped a cultural shift on the subject, and domestic violence became a topic to the public. Number 3. The angel of the house. Or the angel in the house. When it came to the liberation, it all stemmed with the women's rights groups fought for equality and over time made strides in attaining rights and privileges. However, many Victorian women endured their husbands' control and even cruelty, including sensual violence, verbal abuse, and economic deprivation. And there's no way out of it, as it got worse, as a man named Coventry Patmore published a book called Angel in the House. It consisted of poems and the ideal Victorian marriage, and although it came from a place of grief at the loss of his first wife, the book had suddenly become a staple in women's behaviors in marriages, and then became a standard of their status. A woman's proper role was to love, honor, and obey her husband, as her marriage vows stated. A wife's place in the family hierarchy was secondary to her husband, but far from being considered unimportant. A wife's duty to tend to her husband and properly raise her children were considered crucial cornerstones of social stability by the Victorians. Representations of ideal wives were abundant in Victorian culture, providing women of their role models, and the Victorian ideal of the tirelessly patient, sacrificing wife is what depicted the angel in the house. And for these middle-class women, mimicking the angel in the house gave them more opportunities to find a successful match in marriage. Number 2. The House General. The House General, and a term coined in 1861 by Isabella Beeton in her influential manual, Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management. Because for women they needed a manual on how to be a good wife, a good woman, and a good so on and so forth. Here she explained that the mistress of the house is comparable to the commander of an army or the leader of an enterprise. To run a respectful household and secure the happiness and comfort and well-being of her family, she must perform her duties intellectually and thoroughly. For example, she had to organize, delegate, and instruct her servants, which was not an easy task, as many of them were not reliable. Isabella Beeton's upper-class readers may also have a large complement of domestics, a staff requiring supervisions by mistress of the house. Beeton's advised her readers to maintain a housekeeping account book to track spending. She recommends entries and checking the balance monthly, but also keep in mind this is the same lady who told people to put borax in bread to save money. This may not seem like a big punishment for some viewers, but if you were told that you needed a manual to how to live your life so you wouldn't be kicked out of society, that's not something that's a preference today, is it? And number 1, asylum. Now, if you're a woman who was out of the realms and just didn't want to be part of society like everyone else, maybe just suffered a series of mental health issues or even just looked ugly, you might find yourself in an asylum. They had such ridiculous reasons to lock up a woman, as I mentioned in the prison section on this list. From being a vagrant, disorderly, or whatever the case was, you'd go to prison, or even more so, to the asylum. For some families, if they just didn't know what to do with you, they just toss you into the asylum for not being complicit. In an investigation by a very passionate and amazing writer named Nellie Bly, she had experienced firsthand on the field of the mistreatments, the devastating conditions, and harm patients had to endure. In her report published in 1887 and later published in the book 10 Days in the Madhouse, it caused such a sensation it prompted the asylum to implement reforms and shed the light on the significant impact on American culture. Anyways, being a woman was tough as hell in the Victorian era, but with their determination for the right to vote, the women's suffrage movement that enforced lawmakers to ensure them to obtain sustainability today is the reason why there are so many genuinely incredible women who are able to become who they want to be. And it is important to note those who do not know how to look back at where they came from will never get to their destination. So be sure to read up and learn a lot. After all, the answer in our future is laid dormant in our past.